to Exodus chapter 3, if you will, please. Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to look at that context in just a moment. I want to acknowledge a couple of special friends that are guests with us today. I asked Curtis this week about a couple good guys that could help us move. We're local now, in case you haven't heard. We had a short drive this morning. It's just 5 minutes from Chelsea Park over here, which is a big change from what it was. Howard and Cindy, the water's good. And Curtis, when I asked him about two good fellas, recommended first on his list was a guy that we call G. And G, Gerardo, he's here with us this morning, and he's all that Curtis said he would be. He and Eric single-handedly moved all of our stuff, which was quite a feat from where it was to where it is now. And all I said to the guys was, would you all get that and put it on the truck? And would you get that? And I hardly lifted a stick. And I really appreciate G and his hard work. There's another friend that's with us today, Renee. I'm not going to try to say her last name because I'll mess it up bad. But Renee is actually from China. She lives in Guangdong, China. And she works as part of our team in that area with QCing things in the factory and that sort of thing. She's come to rescue us because we're so busy right now and help us out on this side of the ocean. But I hope you'll get a chance to meet Renee. She's delightful, and she's been a huge help to us in our work. Our workforce is kind of like family. And so I always love when our work family meets our church family because both are dear to us. And so I'm so grateful that both of them are here to meet you and for you to meet them. I love the way the Lord connects people together and for the differences that makes in our life. And both these young folks have made big differences in our lives. And so I'm grateful that they're with us today. Exodus chapter 3, if you'll open there, please. I'm going to tell two stories today and make observe some principles that come from both of those stories. And the first one is a story, actually both of them I expect are going to be stories that are familiar to us. The first is the story of a man named Moses. The second is a story of a man named Pharaoh. There were many Pharaohs, but the Pharaoh that's described for us in the book of Exodus. When we are introduced to Moses here in Exodus chapter 3, there's already been a little prior history that has taken place. We are past the point of where Moses was born to a Hebrew family, a family that was part of a huge population of Jewish people that were really a slave people in the land of Egypt. They were being used by the Egyptian pharaohs to build their cities and perhaps to build the pyramids and other monumental works that were being built by them in Egypt. And so Moses' family was a part of that. And as a part of population control, the Pharaoh began ordering that the male children, when they were born, were to be put to death. And Moses was, because of the shrewdness of his mother, was spared that fate because he was put adrift in a little basket that she made, and providentially was found by the daughter of Pharaoh himself, so that his life was spared, and he even got to be nursed through his childhood by his own mother. Moses, when he became of age, having been raised in Pharaoh's house, went out to see how his people fared, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, how they were faring under the harsh treatment of the Egyptians, and found a Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews. And Moses looked this way and that, the text says, and when no one was watching, he saved the Hebrew and in fact killed the Egyptian. And the news about that got around so that Moses had to flee Egypt. He was about 40 years old when that happened. For 40 years then, he is kind of a nobody. He went from being the son of Pharaoh's daughter as a surrogate to now growing up in the wilderness, in really the desert. arid regions. And got married and had kids and was a shepherd. And when we come across him in the 3rd chapter of Exodus, he's now been shepherding for 40 years in the wilderness, and God appears to him in a burning bush, and Moses sees the burning bush, goes aside because he's obviously curious about it, and God speaks to him from the bush, and he says to him, after so many words, says to him in verse 10 of Exodus chapter 3, where we're going to pick up, "Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." Now, God confronts Moses with a big charge. But I want to suggest to you, and this is the element that I want to see that's behind this charge or this mission that God has given to Moses. I want you to see the graciousness of it. Because what God has now communicated to Moses is that God cares about the same thing that Moses cared about. Moses cared about the plight of his people. He cared about the fact that they were in captivity in Egypt. And he tried to do something in order to rescue one of those who was being mistreated by the Egyptians. He tried to save that man from that. And as a result, now he's been ostracized from that land because of his own actions. And what God has come to say to Moses that he wants to do is that he wants to not just save one person, he wants to save the whole populace. He wants to redeem those people from captivity in Egypt and to fulfill the promises that he'd made long ago to their father Abraham. And he wants Moses to be his agent for doing that. Moses is going to be the leader, the messenger of God's grace, who's going to go and communicate these glad tidings to the Hebrews and also communicate to Pharaoh that it's time to let the people go. And Moses is not so excited about that news. In fact, what we read in the following verses and into the next chapter are the various objections that Moses raises to this charge that God's given him. So notice, first of all, like in verse 11, Moses says, "Who am I that I should go?" And God graciously allows him to object, but gives him an answer. He says, you're not going to go by yourself. I'm going to go with you. And I'm going to give you a sign that all of this will work out, because when it's all over with, when this story plays out, you're going to come back to this very mountain and you're going to worship me here. And so then Moses raises a second objection. He says in verse 13 that they're going to ask when I come who it is that sent me. And they're going to ask what the name of the God is that has sent me down here. And he says, what am I going to say? And so the Lord not only tells him what to say, but he actually maps out for him an entire speech. He writes for him a message that he's to deliver to the people when he goes, and then he's to deliver to Pharaoh. And so he takes away that objection as well. Graciously takes away that objection about who will I say sent me. Then if you go to chapter 4 and verse 1, Moses thinks of another problem. Okay, God's going to be with me. He's told me what to say. Well, what if I go and I say that and then the people don't believe me? And so he raises that objection. And God graciously gives Moses now 3 signs that he can perform in order to prove that he's the messenger of God. And so he tells him to take his staff and to throw it on the ground, and when he does, it turns into a snake, and Moses runs away. And then he tells him to pick up the snake by the tail, and when he does, it turns back into a staff. He tells him to put his hand in his bosom, and when he does, he's covered with leprosy. And then he tells him to put it in his bosom again, and when he does and takes it away, then he's healthy once more. He says if those 2 signs don't work, then he's also going to empower him that he will take water and will turn it into blood. So 3 signs that he's going to give Moses that are all going to be ways of proving that God has sent him. And those are the proofs that he can offer to the people and that he can offer to Pharaoh that he's one who's been sent of God. I want you to see the grace in that again, of how God is graciously answering all his objections and taking away those kind of fears. Well, finally in chapter 4 and verse 10, Moses says to the Lord, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past." He said, I never used to be eloquent, and I haven't gotten it since then. He said, I've never been an eloquent man, nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant. He said, it hasn't changed even while we've been talking. But he says, in fact, I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And so he raises the objection that he's not much of a speaker. He's not made to be an ambassador. Maybe he's got a speech impediment. But he doesn't feel equipped for the charge that God has given him. But God graciously responds to that as well and says, who made the tongue? I did. Who made the eye to see? Me again. And so if I made the eye and if I made the tongue, then I'll teach you what to say. And so he takes away that objection as well for Moses. And then finally Moses says in verse 13 of chapter 4, he says, please, Lord, now send the message by whomever thou will. Except for me. Find somebody else to do this. He begs the Lord not to send him. Now, I want you to see what happens now at this point with all the objections that Moses has raised. This is objection number 5. And so Moses, or it says concerning the Lord in verse 14, the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. And let me stop there for a minute. God is angry. God is angry that Moses won't comply, that he doesn't want to go. God's been gracious with Moses and reasoning with him to this point in time. But he's angry about the fact that Moses won't trust him to go and to perform this mission. But here's the point that I want us to see with regard to his anger. In spite of God's anger, God makes a concession, a gracious concession. He says, okay, you don't feel eloquent, then I'm going to send you with your brother. Your older brother Aaron is going to go with you. And so it says in verse the middle or the end of verse 14, he said, is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he speaks fluently. And so Aaron is going to go with you. I'm going to tell you what to say. You tell Aaron what to say. Aaron will be the spokesperson and you will perform the signs. And that's how this is going to work. I want us to see again the grace on the part of God toward Moses in this. Three gracious actions. We could probably enumerate more, but at least 3 gracious actions that I want to review in the story that we just looked at. Number 1, Moses is graciously called by God to participate in a purpose that he cares about, that he himself cares about. What Moses tried to do for one man, God promises that he will do for the entire nation. That's the first gracious thing that God does. Secondly, God is gracious with all of Moses' objections. To every objection, he gives an answer, or he gives a sign, or he gives an assurance. And I just want us to see how gracious God is in answering all of those objections on Moses' part. Thirdly, even though God is angry with Moses, he still makes a gracious concession when Moses objects. When Moses objects to the mission that God has given him. Now he still sends him, but he sends him with a great concession. I want you to go now to chapter 5 of the text, chapter 5. And I want us to see when Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh and when they make the announcement to him that God has taken note of his people and that God wants something from Pharaoh. God is calling upon Pharaoh to let the people go. And so in chapter 5 and verse 1 it says, and afterward Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast for me in the wilderness. Now, I want us to see the grace in this as well. God didn't have to ask Pharaoh permission. But what he does here with Pharaoh is the same thing that he did with Moses. He calls upon Pharaoh graciously to participate in a purpose that he has in mind for his people. And he doesn't have to ask him, but he does. He asks him to let the people go into the wilderness in order that they might worship. Pharaoh refuses. Verse 2, Pharaoh said, who is the Lord? that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go. And so Moses and Aaron make another appeal to him. But he finally says at the end in verse 4, the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you draw the people away from their work? Get back to your labors. And Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now many, and would you have them cease from their labor? And Pharaoh not only refuses to let the people go, but he that very day gives instructions that the workload of the people is to be increased in this way. It had been his practice to provide them with the raw materials, the straw and the clay that would be necessary that they could make the bricks that they were using to construct the cities. But he said, starting on that day, that he was no longer going to give them the straw. They were going to have to go and gather the straw themselves, get their own raw materials, and then make the brick. But the quota, the daily quota that was expected of them was not going to go down. They still had to maintain the same kind of production, but now they had to gather the raw materials along with making the bricks. And when they don't meet their quotas, then those that are the foremen, the Hebrew foremen, are taken and they're beaten as a consequence of that failure on their part. Now, I just want us to appreciate the fact that things have gotten worse now for the Hebrews. And here's the thing that I want us to see with regard to God and Pharaoh. God let Pharaoh do that. He graciously allowed him to be abusive to his own people. And so Moses and Aaron go back and they make another pitch to him. Go to chapter 7 of the book, Exodus chapter 7, and look at verse 8. And this time, what God does is the speech didn't work, and so now God is going to give Pharaoh a sign. And so Moses is told to go into the presence of Pharaoh, and in verse 8 he says, when Pharaoh speaks to you saying, work a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh that it may become a serpent. And so Moses and Aaron do that. They give him a sign, and Pharaoh is not convinced by the sign. Verse 13 says, and yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. So he still doesn't comply. But God doesn't stop there. He gives him a sign, and now he gives him a warning. And so on the day that Pharaoh was going out to bathe in the Nile, beginning in verse 14, we're told that Moses and Aaron are to approach him, and the Nile River is to be smote with the rod, and when it does, it turns into blood. And so a warning sign is given to Pharaoh. And yet, we're told in verse 22 of the text, but the magicians of Egypt did the same thing with their secret arts. That is, they're able to turn water into blood, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord has said. So he still doesn't comply. Now, the Lord does something more with Pharaoh. He's already given him a sign. He's already given him a warning. And now he gives him a burden. The next thing that God does is he tells Pharaoh, and every time he tells him ahead of time what he's going to do. He tells him that he's going to send frogs on the land, and that the frogs are going to be a great plague. Verse 1 of chapter 8, the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite your whole territory with frogs. And so he does. The frogs are everywhere. They're in the pitcher. They're in the house. They're everywhere in the land. They overrun the land. And finally, Pharaoh relents as a result of this particular burden. Verse 8 of chapter 8 says, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said to them, entreat the Lord that he may remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go that they may sacrifice to the Lord. And God graciously makes another concession for Pharaoh. He says, verse 9, Moses said to Pharaoh, the honor is yours to tell me, when shall I entreat for you and your servants and your people that the frogs be destroyed from you and from your houses, that they may be left only in the Nile? Now, I don't know why he said tomorrow. Why wouldn't he say right now? But he said in verse 10, he says tomorrow. And Moses says, may it be according to your word, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. And so, not only does God graciously provide a sign and a warning and a burden, but now God provides relief from something that was the consequence of his own actions, and gives him the privilege of choosing when that relief is going to take place. And it happens just the way that he asked for it to happen. But notice, if you will, in verse 13 or verse 15 of the text, but when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Now, I want you to see this in the story of God and Pharaoh. Pharaoh is graciously called by God to participate in God's purpose. God doesn't have to ask him, but God does ask him. Pharaoh is graciously permitted to abuse God's people and to test God's patience. God lets him do that. God graciously gives him a sign, the serpent. He gives him a warning, the river turning to blood. He gives him a burden, the frogs that overrun the land. And then he gives him relief at a time of his own choosing. All of those are gracious acts on the part of God. I want you to see that what we have in the story is a picture of two men. One man named Moses and one man named Pharaoh, both of whom are graciously called by God to participate in God's purposes. And this is an important point. Neither of them want to do it. Moses doesn't want to go. And Pharaoh doesn't want to let go. Neither of them want to do the thing that God has called them to do, even though it's a gracious invitation on the part of God to let them participate in what He's doing. Neither of them want to do it. But God is gracious in dealing with both of them. He's gracious in dealing with Moses' objections. He's gracious in making some concessions with Moses' objections. And He's gracious in dealing with Pharaoh and his stubborn responses. But here's the end result of those two men who are confronted by God's grace. One man is confronted by God's grace, and he conforms. He's gradually transformed by the way that God deals with him so graciously. The other man is confronted by God's grace, and he fights it rather than conforming to it. And gradually over time, he becomes more and more hardened. But I want you to see that grace is behind the way that God deals with both of these men. Now I want to make 4 observations from those two stories. Here's the first one. I want us to observe the impartiality of God's grace. The impartiality of God's grace. Here is Moses, and here is Aaron. Here is Moses, and here is Pharaoh. And how does God deal with both men? He deals with both men graciously. He deals with both men mercifully. He deals with both men compassionately. And the lesson that teaches us is that's the way that God is toward all men. God is not a God who's against us. God is a God who's for us. And the things that He imposes on us, the burdens that He places, the things that He does in our life are intended to show us, to demonstrate how for us He is, not that He's against us. And He's doing that with Moses, and He's doing that with Pharaoh, and what He does with Moses and Pharaoh is what He does with all. God's grace is impartially shown. The second observation that I want us to make from these two stories, I want you to observe the longevity of God's grace. Not only is God impartially gracious to all, but God's grace is so very patient. So He lets Moses argue with him, and even makes a concession, though he's angry with Moses and Moses' objections. And if he got angry with Moses, and even though the text doesn't say, don't you reckon he got angry with Pharaoh too? You know it had to wear on his patience. And yet He doesn't just give Pharaoh a sign and a warning and a burden, he follows with 7 more signs that are also great burdens and plagues in order to try to change his mind, to change his heart. And so God's grace with him is so very long. It's so very patient. In fact, I think one of the greatest demonstrations of God's grace with Pharaoh is what's told in in chapter 5, in the middle part of the text, when Pharaoh increases the burden on the people. Look at the way that Moses responds to the Lord when he comes back and he talks to him about what's happened. I mean, I went and asked Pharaoh to let the people go, and now look, it's worse. And Moses puts it on the Lord. He says he doesn't blame Pharaoh for making it worse. He blames the Lord for making it worse because the Lord provoked Pharaoh to do something worse to the people. And so he says in verse 22, Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why hast thou brought harm to this people? Why didst thou ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in thy name, he has done harm to this people, and thou hast not delivered thy people at all. You've let it happen. And so part of the objection on the part of Moses is that God is being so gracious with Pharaoh. Why is he why is this happening? And why aren't you doing more? Is the thing that troubles him. And the fact is that God is going to be a lot more patient with Pharaoh than he's even demonstrated to this point in time. It's going to last for several months, it would seem, as the story plays out that God shows him grace. Now, that ought to be a comfort to us. We will never outdo God's grace. I mean, sometimes we think that we're doing something compassionate or we're doing something merciful, and you're just never going to outdo the way God is about that. Moses is troubled about how gracious God is with Pharaoh. And the paradox in all of that is that because God is gracious, people get away with stuff. Do you know that? I mean, bad people get away with things because of the fact that God is gracious. And innocent people suffer because of the fact that God lets people get away with it. But do you see, you can't have both? If God is going to be gracious, you know what that means? It means that we're going to get away with some stuff. Do you see that? And if He's going to... Where do you draw the line with who you're going to be gracious toward? You know, who you're going to let get away with some stuff and who you're going to zap the moment they do something. Well, the way the story plays out is that God is gracious with all of us. And so we see the longevity of His grace demonstrated in this great story. The third thing I want you to observe in the story is the potential in God's grace. The potential in God's grace. Look, if you would, at chapter 11 and verse 6. And I want you to see what God does with Moses over the course of all of this conflict with Pharaoh. In chapter 11 it says, and in verse 3 it says, the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Furthermore, the man Moses himself was greatly esteemed in the land of Egypt, both in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. Moses had all of these objections to why he wasn't the one that God should send. And what God does over the course of time is He makes Moses a great leader, graciously makes him, transforms him into somebody that God can really use. Somebody who has the kind of heart that God set out to create in him. And not only does Moses gain credibility with his own people, but he gains credibility with Pharaoh's people, so that Pharaoh's his own cabinet is impressed with Moses. And he is greatly esteemed there. What I want us to see in that is the beauty of what God's grace does with us when we conform, when we're transformed by it, when we comply, when we are convicted by it, when we're changed by it. Then God can make us so useful to His purposes. And He does with Moses. Now, if God could do that with Moses, just imagine. What if Moses had gone into Pharaoh and he said, you know, the Lord said, I want you to let my people go. And here's the signs that he appeared to me. And he did some of the things that he did. He turned the staff into a serpent. He turned the water into blood. And Pharaoh said, wow, you all go do whatever the Lord wants you to do. Go. Now, what could his story have been? What might this Pharaoh have been had he just listened, had he just conformed? And instead, his story, he becomes the villain by his own choice. And his story is a tragic story of wasted potential and wasted time. Because here's a man that's confronted by God's grace and he's not changed by it. In fact, he's hardened by the grace of God. So there's great potential in God's grace for anyone who's changed by it. The fourth observation that I want us to make in the text is to observe the limitations of God's grace. The limitations. You'd think, well, what could limit the grace of God? Well, I tell you what can limit the grace of God is my reaction to it. We see Moses, and he was confronted with the grace of God, and he didn't want to do what God was calling on him to do. And yet he finally complied. And God graciously made concessions with him. And he grew and was transformed and what was changed. But I want you to see what happens every time God shows grace to Pharaoh. Chapter 8 and verse 15, the text that we already read a moment ago, it says there, chapter 8 again, verse 15, but when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, listen, is there grace and relief? When Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Chapter 8 and verse 31, and the Lord did as Moses asked and removed the swarms of insects from Pharaoh, from his servants and from his people. Not one remained, not one insect was left. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and he did not let the people go. There was relief, there was grace, and Pharaoh's heart got hard. In chapter 9 and verse 34, the text says, but when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, when God took away the hail, he sinned again and hardened his heart, he and his servants, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let the sons of Israel go, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. In chapter 10 and verse 16, then Pharaoh hurriedly called for Moses and Aaron, and he said to them, I've sinned against the Lord your God. Please forgive my sin only this once, and make supplication to the Lord your God, the Lord your God, that he would only remove this death from me. And he went out from Pharaoh and he made supplication to the Lord. And so the Lord shifted the wind to a very strong west wind, which took the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea. Not one locust was left in all the territory of Egypt. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and did not let the sons of Israel go. God shows Pharaoh grace. And when Pharaoh gets relief, his heart gets hard. In Romans chapter 9 and verse 14, there's a text that I think is a bit of a commentary on what happens in all of those stories. Romans 9 and verse 14, Paul writes this, what shall we say then? There is no injustice with God, is there? May it never be. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Tell me, who does God have mercy on? And who does he have compassion for? Just Moses? Fact is, he has mercy and he has compassion on all. So then it doesn't depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. For the Scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up to demonstrate my power in you, that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. So then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. And could I say, what does the hardening and what does the softening? What makes a man more stubborn and what makes a man more compliant to the will of God is the fact that God is so gracious in dealing with man. And so we have one man who's confronted with the grace of God and he is convicted by it, he's changed by it. and another man who's witnessed to, experiences the grace of God in his life, and it just makes him more stubborn. Now, could I say that that's no different for me and you? We've all experienced God's grace in our life. And we've all had things that God has called us to do that we frankly don't want to do, right? We don't want to change. We don't want to comply. We don't want to do that. And God is gracious with us in that. Sometimes He warns us. Sometimes He burdens us. Sometimes He disciplines us to channel us in the right direction. But He is always gracious in the way He deals with us in all those situations. And there's one of two effects for you and me. We either are changed by it or we're hardened by it. I looked out at the hills last night, out the back window, and looked up at the stars. Just thought about how gracious God is in bringing us where we are. I look around at this group and dear friends and people who care about our well-being and about our future and about where we are and about where we're going, and who want the best for us and who want the best for one another. And that is such a gift. I work with people that work hard together and that really are a family. And God has been so gracious in that. I got a wife that I don't deserve. I have friends that I don't deserve. God is so gracious. It makes me want to be different. It makes me want to be more for Him. How does His grace affect you? How's it changed you lately? Because grace is calculated to work on our heart in such a way that we are overcome by it, that we are in awe of it, that we're transformed by it. That's the purpose of God. And if that won't change me, there's no power that will. If grace doesn't change me, then there's not any force that God can bring to bear on a human heart that's more powerful than His abundant grace, which was shown more than ever in the fact that He gave us His Son. Won't you be changed by that today? Won't you conform to His grace in whatever way is needful in your life? And if we can help you with that change, won't you come as we stand and as our brother leads us?